Alrighty. Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Let's go to Ephesians 3 again, looking at verses 14 to 21, right in there. And this is so we're just going to keep on this track of power of intercessory prayer. So we called it fire from heaven. We're getting that from excuse me. We're getting that from Elijah, and not a whole lot of background on Elijah, but just taking off on Elijah and his episode from Mount Carmel and the prophets of, or the priest of Baal, I should say, the priest of Baal, and his calling down fire from heaven, and talking about intercessory prayer and the power of intercessory prayer, and really getting into a lot more than that from Paul here from verses 14 through 21. Ultimately, the direction we're going gets at the heart of what Paul is praying. So it's not just intercessory prayer, but what is it that Paul is praying for on behalf of the believers in Ephesus? And so we can read this. He says, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man." Now, I should say, this is a wild ride in the Greek text. If you're looking at this, Paul really has an interesting grammatical formation here throughout this this whole thing. If you try to unscramble it, anyway, something going on with my voice today. But that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of you. See, you're just finding a whole bunch of that's and infinitives and all that stuff in there, and it just sounds like a big run-on sometimes, which is Paul's tendency from time to time, but anyway, I digress. But what is the length and breadth and length and height and depth, and to know, and we'll unscramble this a little bit, hopefully, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. But hopefully, you sort of get where Paul is going with this, right? So as he elongates in this prayer, you get the sense of, well, what in the world is he going for here? You know, he's going for this sense of an experience on behalf of these believers, or what is central, what is primary, but I would say what is foundational, right? Because if you saw in there or listened in there, it says, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, those happen to be perfect tense participles. It doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but when you say perfect tense, that's something that's established. That's not something that's wishful or aspirational. Well, I really, like he's saying, like, I really hope that at some point you'll become rooted and grounded in love. No, he's saying that you are, rooted. You've got this root system and you've got this foundation in love. I just hope that it can become diffused throughout your whole being, and it takes this form of this knowledge of the love of Christ. And then he further kind of describes that as being this sense of filling, that you be filled up to all the fullness of God. As a matter of fact, if you just let your eyes drift down there to chapter 4 and verse 13, you'll read, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. You see that same expression where it says all the fullness of God, now all the fullness of Christ. Get the idea, pleroma there, used in the Greek. But then in verse 20, where now he sort of as you can expect, Paul does this. He goes on and on. He builds to this crescendo, like he's just hyping himself to a crescendo. And then he says, now to him, and in the Greek then it's like to him, who him, the one who is able, above all, up, out, and over the top, abundantly, beyond, okay. He's not just able, but he's able above all, way over, beyond all that we can ask or think, according to what? According to the power that works in us. Now this is significant. It's going to be significant to a little argument I'm going to prosecute here. This power that works in us. I think this is just significant to this little block of text is so significant to what I will make the case to understanding 5:18. Now 5:18, and do not get drunk with wine, for that's dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. And now he talks about here that you may be filled up for 3:19. You understand 5:18, 3:19 by 5:18, I think. And I've tried to make that case here. I think he elongates, or at least he gives us a foretaste of what 5:18 is. So if we're going to be filled, so if we had to sort of advance this, and I understand we're talking about intercessory prayer, right? So prayer in general, intercessory prayer in particular, and then what is the apostle praying for? So he says, I'm praying for something that's foundational. It's the love of God, just 5:5 of Romans, shed abroad in your heart, diffused throughout your being, which he's going to describe then as something sensory, something you can experience, which is the fullness of God. What's the fullness of God? But this love that's all pervasive, permeates your entire being, filled up to all the fullness of God. So if I had to ask any one of us, pointing to that verse, so we look at 3:19 and put your index finger on that and point at it and say, okay, what is that? So we've read it a million times and say, okay, what is that? Have you ever experienced it, and how do you know? By what measure? Now, purely rhetorical, but sincerely. And so you're journaling and you're writing this down, and note to self, wow, Paul says that he's praying on behalf of them. Well, how would they know whenever they received it? How would he know whenever they received it? What is that? What would it be? How would I know? Paul, if I were asking him, how would I know? What is it to experience? How would I know if I've ever experienced the fullness of God? What would it be to experience the fullness of God? What would it be to know the love of Christ? And this is 2 Corinthians 5:14, right? Again, you just look wherever that expression, wherever you find that expression, just look for that little phrase anywhere in the New Testament or anywhere in the Pauline letters, Paul's letters, the love of Christ. This would be not our love for him, but his love for us. So you think of God's love for me, Christ's love for me, demonstrated at the cross, all that. That is not something just, that is an objective reality. That is an objective truth. It's a historical fact. It was demonstrated. It was proven. We get that. But there's something affective about that. We could say of any one of us, or we could say to someone, I love you. But hopefully there's something that we sense about that. There's something hopefully that impacts us qualitatively, that we get that. It's not just words, but we actually, okay, that impresses me, that influences me, that impacts me on some level. So when he says to know, he says not to know about, not to factually connect with that, but to know that. Then he says, well, that surpasses knowledge. Okay, so he says as if you could know it. So I want you to know it as if you could know it. But what he's saying is you really can't know it completely. You do not have the capacity to know God completely, is what he's saying. Well, if you did, you would somehow explode, maybe. I don't know. We don't physiologically or intellectually have the capacity, to know God completely. Obviously, we are finite creatures. We cannot know the infinite. We don't have that type of intellectual capacity, nor physiologically could we sustain a direct encounter with God, right? I mean, this was the argument with Moses. Could you bear to see Well, no, you'll see my backward parts. Remember that whole exchange? I think it's Exodus 33 or somewhere in there, right? I'll hide you in the cleft of the rock somewhere, there, and you'll see me as I go away from you. Something of this regard. but again, to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. See, this is all of experiential value, and this is what Paul is talking about ultimately. So the power of intercessory prayer, but linked to filling. So this idea of, and I think this is where most Christians have to draw a complete blank. Just white noise when it talks to now, what would it be to say, well, I'm filled? And Paul says, well, you should operate the Christian life on this basis that you be filled. You're utilizing the Spirit in such a way that if you are going to be sanctified in your life, that if you're going to appropriate the Christian life in such a way to manifest the life of Christ in your daily life, his qualities, his virtues, then you're going to need the Spirit to fill you to do that. If you're going to serve him, if you're going to use the gifts that he has given you, you should be filled. If you're going to be missional in your life, to be a witness for him and so on, you need to be filled to do that. And so there needs to be this discipline to be able to engage this mechanism. And where this conversation started, I guess, was this phrase, according to the power that works in us. And the argument that we will eventually make here is that power never ceases to work. I will make this case because he says this in 3:20, according to the power, and this is present tense, the power that is working in us. It's as though the Spirit of God is present and active, and his operations are continuously at work in us. The problem is us not engaging with those. It's sort of like maybe in this, I'm not equating the Spirit of God with an inanimate force, but I'm just saying, if you had an electric socket over here and you do not plug into it, you are not engaging with that power source. And I'm just saying there's some disconnect I think we have. We can either operate according to our own power or be disengaged from that power source, or we're engaged in it. And the question is how do we engage? What is the mechanism by which we engage? How do we actuate that? And I believe, as we've suggested almost constantly, that it's kind of counterintuitive, but it is a passive response to an active influence. And this seems to be always the case in the Christian life. That is this idea of surrender, which is most difficult. So I'm going to retrace a bit before we advance further into the text, but hopefully we get into some of the more exegetical pieces. But just to restate a little bit about the notion of prayer and intercessory prayer, but we understand in general prayer being communication with God, but to intercede is basically where I take my need, I consciously take my needs and put them to the side, which is a very interesting discipline, intercessory prayer. When you think about it, maybe most folks think about prayer as it's such a great opportunity that God has given us to take our needs directly to him. And in fact, our praises, our gratitude, all those things directly to him, and truly we can. But even if it's just our needs, and certainly we can. But intercession, which isn't a word that we use a lot. But in the sense of spiritual things and spiritual disciplines, intercessory prayer is of paramount value because it teaches us to take our needs and our sort of self-consciousness and push that down deliberately and by intention, to push that down and to elevate the needs of someone else much higher, and to put someone else maybe on that higher plane and say someone else has needs, someone else has concerns, and then to take those concerns, whatever they are, and maybe it makes us much more conscious of other people and maybe much more attentive, and to look and to see and to discover what those needs are, and then to bring those before God. And it could be that something has happened in my own inner circle, and I'm just conscious about that, or something has happened in my world, and this arouses my spiritual sensitivity somehow, and then I'm compelled. I'm compelled to invite God into the matter to do what he alone can do, because I simply cannot. I cannot. I could exhaust all of my resources and could not bring anything to bear on this particular matter. I just can't, especially if there's some distance involved, or if it's financial, or if it's a health thing, or whatever it is, or if it's just something that has to do with whatever advice might be given, or wisdom might be, or something inscrutable, or whatever it is. But we just simply say, I'm going to invite God into this. I mean, imagine that. Imagine, well, we're going to pray, we're going to bring God into this matter, so on. And so it can be some spiritual deficiency that you see, and this with all humility and in a non-judgmental way. And you're just saying, I'm going to pray for that bit of spiritual growth in someone or something. But you do that. And that can be as well in your own community, in your own nation, to pray for that. Isn't that the whole gist of people that pray for spiritual renewal and revival or so on? And such were the times, as we pointed out, in ancient Israel. Such were the times with Elijah. That's what brought Elijah to that point where he came before the people of God, wayward as they were, and said, how long will you stand there frozen, paralyzed between two? You can't make up your minds whether you're going to worship a pagan deity of wood and stone, or whether you're going to worship the one true God of Israel. So make up your mind. And the God that answers by fire, that will be the one true God. And can you imagine that Elijah sets up this set of this criteria, for how we will decide. This is how the matter will be decided. He says, I will pray. I will bring God into this matter. I will bring God into this, and the living God will deliver very specific proofs to you. These will be irrefutable proofs, that he will rain down fire from heaven, and you'll each team here will reconstruct an altar and will set wood and sacrifices on the altar, and the God that rains down fire, that will be the true God. And can you imagine how confident? Now Elijah would have to be pretty confident, right? Pretty confident that God would respond to prayer, that God would hear prayer. And so confident he was, as you recall the whole episode there in the scene, that he digs a trench around this. Number one, it's pretty pathetic because the altar that normally was used for the worship of God was just in complete disarray. So this just tells what the spiritual condition of the people was. And so this had to be repaired. And then he puts the sacrifice on it, he puts the wood on it, but he digs a trench around it, and he douses it down so thoroughly, like 3 times, with water, that it fills up the trench. And then, of course, the fire descends descends upon it. And so the people would have proof beyond any doubt, any reasonable doubt. So that's the kind of faith he had. And this was associated with effective intercessory prayer. Now we see this, right? We see this, that this wasn't just some prophet, praying some prayer and then God answered. You really have to see the principles here involved, that this was Elijah interceding on behalf of his people who were faithless. And here's a man of incredible faith because he believed God. We don't have a whole lot of history of Elijah here. We just don't. We have only this man who stood before Ahab. It's just absolutely incredible, right? Here's this. You just have to imagine Elijah, which I do in 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 1. We're just in 1 Kings 18 here, but 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse 1, he's some guy that kind of rolled out of the hills. It says he's a Tishbite from Tishbe. And I mean, if you're translating it from Hebrew, that's all you get. He's a Tishbite, he's from Tishbe. Who knows where that is? That's how obscure it is. We think it's in some northern Transjordan region, but we don't know really. It's just some obscure place, and it's meant to be that way. Just, we don't know where he came from. But here's this guy comes rolling in from nowhere, dressed like who knows what, like really some guy from nowhere, stands before this king, right, this all-important king, and says, hey, guess what, king? Guess what? There's not going to be spit. There's not going to be anything. You're not going to get any dew, no precipitation. It's going to be bone dry, beyond bone dry, except I say so, period. Wow. You know what that says? That's a mic drop right there. And you know what that means? That means, no water, no rain, no anything, of course, but that means no crops, no food. You know what that means? Death. Death. And the stench of death throughout the land. No food, famine, death. Wow. I mean, what if that doesn't happen? I mean, he's the biggest fool, right? But, I mean, there's worse consequences than being the biggest fool. There's also the loss of his life for standing before a king like that. But nonetheless, he's a guy that's going to have to live with the consequences of that because he's going to live in the land that's not going to have any water, not going to have any food, not going to have anything. How's he going to survive, right? So anyway, this is just faith, and he's going to go from there, and he's going to proceed to stand before some widow, and the same thing, and expecting her to take care of him, and so on. And you know how the whole account, right? So you have one preceding episode after he's going to go right from there from a brook, where he's going to be fed by ravens, and then the brook is going to start to dry up till he sees just nothing but a dry riverbed, and then God's going to tell him, go on down there, and hey, I'll tell you what, I've got a widow that's going to take care of you. A widow, right? A widow. And we think, big deal. Yeah, but widows in those days, they were the poorest people around. And she says, hey, you know what? I've got this little handful of meal, and that's it. And when that's gone, we're gonna die. And actually, my son's gathering a few sticks, and we're gonna cook this stuff, and then we're just gonna die. We're gonna die because all the food's gone. And you want what? You want me to prepare you what? So here again, this is nothing but just faith. And then the boy gets sick, right? And so here's someone who's going to be raised from the dead. And you're seeing all these faith building, till he has the standoff with the priests on Carmel. God's just building into the life of this prophet all of these opportunities to build his faith and to make him this great man of prayer. Until finally, he's standing there on Carmel, And, when's this drought going to be over? When is this drought going to be over finally? And so the last scene we have is him outrunning some horse, proclaiming, God sent the rain, God sent the rain, God sent the rain. This is a man of great faith, right? And you see the faith associated with intercessory prayer. The same as what you see in the book of James, where James will say, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And you see this bookended in the book of James. That's James chapter 5, verse 16 in the second part. But then you look at James chapter 1, and I think it's James chapter 1 and verse 6, James chapter 1 and verse 5, but if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, right? But then he says, verse 6, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering or nothing doubting, right? So Elijah's simple and brief, though passionate appeal to God for an answer. This is in stark contrast then to all those prophets of Baal, because all those prophets of Baal, what were they doing? They're jumping about the altar. You remember them? So in the whole account, what are they doing? And crying out to their God of stone and their God of wood or stone or whatever it is. All their frenzied antics and all the things that it says from morning until night. They're doing this all the while. If you're translating it from the Hebrew, actually, there's some colorful remarks in there that I think for the sake of the English, we don't really translate some of those remarks that Elijah makes. He makes some interesting remarks at them, about Baal, maybe some of the activities that Baal is doing. You can maybe check some of that. Nonetheless, morning till night, all these things. And, Elijah just said, hey, how about some fire, God? How about sending? Fire falls when people pray in faith. It's amazing. People pray in faith, God delivers results. And we see Daniel doing the same thing, and we pointed this out last week. You see Daniel chapter 2, you see Daniel chapter 6. Both cases, Daniel's life is on the line. There's no question. And what's amazing is, in both of those cases, especially in the Daniel chapter, if you have the time, check out Daniel chapter 2, I think it's verses 12 through 19, right in there. And just read them slowly and check out that passage because and say, what if that were me? And just imagine yourself, you're in a foreign country. Maybe not just you don't have to be in a foreign country. I give you a pass. Just say, you're just not home. You're just someplace else. And it's unfamiliar to you. And it's maybe not a friendly place. And it's not your comfort zone. And now everything's turned against you. And there's a bunch of hostiles. And basically your life is on the line. And their life is on the line. And it's just an incredible set of circumstances. So Daniel basically puts himself out there and says, listen, put it all on me. Just go ahead and put it all on me. I'll take the entire thing on myself. And then he throws the whole thing on God, basically. The whole thing on God. And says, God, I'm taking this whole thing and I'm putting it all on you. And if you don't answer, then it's all over, basically. And this is not futility on Daniel's part. It's like Elijah. Because I know the fire is going to come. And this is Daniel saying, I know you're going to give me the answer. I mean, can you imagine a king who says, so I had a dream. So I had this dream. And Yeah, so I'm going to need you guys, his soothsayers, I'm going to need you guys to go ahead and give me the interpretation of the dream. And of course, the soothsayers are saying, sure, that's no problem. That's no problem, King. Just go ahead and tell us what the dream is, because they've got the dream book. They got the dream book, and it's like the decoder. And these guys went to school for this. And they went to school for this, and they had the ways of decoding the dreams. It's sort of like the Freudian thing, the Freudian, and Freud, he's got his whole thing. He's going to decode it. Just go ahead, tell me what, okay, so you saw a tree in a dream, and a tree, okay, yeah, tree, yeah, that's symbolism for this, and so on, so on. So I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the gist of it. So anyway, the boys there, would just go to their dream book, but they had to know what, but the king's smarter than that, right? The king says, hey, here's what you're going to do. You're going to tell me what the dream was. And so now their book is worthless. So they're going like, well, we can't. So he said, nobody can tell the king that. Nobody. So what does Daniel do? He says, I got you covered. So they're all going to die. All of them, including Daniel. And he says, well, I got you covered. I'll take care of this because my God can handle that. That's nothing for my God. My God will tell me what the dream was and the interpretation of it. So Daniel took that all on himself. Would you be able to keep your head in that whole thing? Would you be able to keep your head? Because they'd already been given the death sentence. That's key, right? Already been told you're all going to die. And then Daniel had to step in. This is how much credibility he had. He had to step in and say, okay, but wait, if I may, would I be allowed to seek my God and take care of this for you? Could I do this? And he was allowed to do that. So think of the faith, and see, that's where we see how faith is so critical to intercessory prayer. Now, what I have to tell you, the sneak preview to go to Ephesians here, is that faith is going to be critical in this whole process. I'll tell you, I'll just see if you can check this out in Ephesians for this passage in 14 and following, right? Just as a sneak preview, and then we'll go back for a second. So he says, for this reason I bow my knees before the Father, whom every family in heaven on earth derives its name. He grants you according to the riches of his glory to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the... Now, when he says to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, one of the things you see here is, I want you to, and I'll get to this in a bit, but I want you to be strengthened. And how is that going to come to you? It's going to be channeled. It's going to come by means of his Spirit. And where? On the inside, the core of your being. But then he says, almost a parallel expression, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts, but it's through faith. Like, how does that come about? It's through faith, just like the others, through his Spirit and through faith. So I think these are sort of tandem in a way. In other words, I think that, the Spirit is going to be responsible for this. I think that, in other words, somewhere in there, I think the ability to believe is tied up with what the Spirit delivers. And I think I can reconcile those things from the passage. I think this is what Paul is saying somewhat in here, that this is all sort of blended in. I don't think he's somehow saying, if you believe enough, then this will happen. But what I think he's saying is that somehow, if you are surrendered to the Spirit's work in your life, he's going to deliver the ability to this ability to trust and rely and so on and so forth. And I think when you see someone like Elijah, I think when you see someone like Daniel, and I think when you see true men and women of God in the Word, these are people that are absolutely surrendered, absolutely given over is the word. Given over to God in every aspect of their life, and that in fact kind of defines what faith is. Faith is, I'm not holding anything back. I'm totally available to you, God, and so on. And that's where we get into, I think, some other interesting uses of inanimate things in Scripture. When I think of that burning bush, totally available. When I think of those 6 stone water pots in Cana, when I think of other things that are certainly usable like this in Scripture. So we always have to ask then, how do I come to be a person of great faith? Where do I get that from? Does that somehow come from within me? How can I make myself believe? And certainly there are things that can promote faith and strengthen faith, but ultimately it's going to reduce to how surrendered am I? And I think that prayer, intercessory prayer, being less of self, more selfless, things like that can promote that. But the more that the Spirit of God, His operations are promoted and at work, then the more reliant, dependent upon God for all things we are. So we read the biblical accounts of Daniel's exploits. We can read those, Daniel in the lion's den, almost like these cartoonish caricatures, Yet in reality, here's a man that his trust in God translates into a prayer life that achieved results with God. And we know Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, without faith, it's impossible to please God. He that comes to God, and that's a kind of a euphemistic expression for prayer, he that comes to God must believe that he is, that he's a rewarder for them that diligently seek him. And the case that will make time and time again, he that comes to God must believe that he is. And you say, well, duh, of course I believe God exists. But I don't think that's what he's driving at here. Because in chapter 11, throughout, it says, by faith Noah, by faith Enoch, by faith Sarah, by faith Abraham, by faith Moses, and so on and so on. Because every single one of those individuals had circumstances. And basically what the writer is saying is they believed God even though their circumstances militated otherwise. And this is always the case, that we believe God, we rely upon God, even though our temporal lives and our temporal circumstances will cause our eyes to see things that will make our minds say, gotta doubt that God can handle that. Yeah, gotta doubt that, and basically we'll come to the conclusion that, why should I even pray about that? That's too far gone. No, I won't even bother to pray about that. And even intercede on behalf of, that's impossible. No, I shouldn't even. So Oswald Chambers, if he's written My Utmost for His Highest, of course he did a lot more than that with his young, brief life. But he once wrote, to say that prayer changes things is not as close to the truth as saying prayer changes me and then I change things. God has established things so that prayer on the basis of redemption changes the way a person looks at things. And that's a fair way to look at it. Is it prayer that moves me, or is it prayer that moves God? That's interesting. You have to think about that. From the vantage point of our human bottom-up perspective, we pray and God answers, but we can hardly say that we move the hand of God, for what human has such power to do so? Yet, in God's foresight, he has placed prayer into our hands to afford to us the privilege of sharing in the disposition and disposition of his will, though the mystery is just that, a mystery. The secret things belong to the Lord, Deuteronomy 29:29. So if faith is the basis for effective intercessory prayer, how does one possess such faith, especially when it's easy to find reasons to doubt? I grabbed a few verses here, and the context is rather interesting, but you remember the case in Mark chapter 9 and verse 24. Immediately the boy's father cried out and said, "I do believe, help my unbelief." The context there is where in verse 19 it says, "And he answered and said unto them, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit threw him into a convulsion, and falling to the ground and began rolling around, foaming at the mouth. And he asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. He's often thrown him about in the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us, help us." And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. And there are other passages. You think of so-called Didymus or the twin there, or doubting Thomas. Except I see. Except I see the nail prints in his hand from John chapter 20 and verse 25. So I think it's important that we understand the notion of intercessory prayer, the notion of, at least from the standpoint of setting our needs to the side, promoting the needs of someone else, the importance of faith being central, and that the notion of faith being something that doesn't necessarily derive from ourselves, but comes as a result of our surrender to God. How do we get there? How do we get to that point of surrender? And I think the text will teach us that this is something that the Spirit of God brings in us. If you see in verse 16, again, passive. All of the disciplines are a passive response to an active influence. The active influence is seen in verse 20. The passive response is seen in verse 16. To be strengthened with power through his Spirit, where? In the inner man. It's nothing from the outside that we're missing. It's something that we already possess, but that we have to yield to that influence. And this is the basic pattern of the Christian life. There is something that is at work in us, but that we have to learn to be yielded to it. And this strength is something that we receive. So this idea of yielding to it, receiving it, and it produces something. What does it produce? It produces something that is located in our hearts. This is when you see the word hearts, inner man doesn't get us very far. There's one little word, eso, right? Inner man. It just tells us where. Hearts, cardia, isn't just thump, thump, thump. Hearts, cardia, tells us qualitatively. It tells us, because it's a metaphor, but it tells us the seat of our affections, which means, or our disposition, our affections. So it tells us that Christ may dwell in our hearts. He's already there. So it tells us how he dwells. How he dwells. Rooted, so It's the idea rooted, grounded in love, but that love has to be pervasive throughout our being. And this is the whole idea of the passage. Through faith. It is this environment of faith, this environment of reliance, trusting, and you get this whole idea that there's this atmosphere of love and trust and everything that just exists there, and it's all centered around Him. And this is the spirit of the fullness of God. This is what Paul is trying to promote through what he's praying. So what we're talking about in intercessory prayer, we're talking more about that which he's praying on behalf of these believers, that they have this fullness of God, really. Not this sort of halfway Christian life, which I think many have. And many can have throughout the duration of their entire Christian experience. This kind of halfway Christian life where you rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Go through the workaday world, attend a worship service, rinse and repeat, do it again. But where do you get to that? In other words, just anybody within the sound of my voice or watching this, just take a look at 3:19 and tell me that's your experience, and I'll be quiet. Just tell me that's your experience and we'll be all done. Tell me that's your experience. And when you experience, that's your encounter. Because we can talk about degrees of intensity, we can talk about duration, we can talk about frequency, we can talk about any of that stuff. But I would just say, linking that to 5:18, I'm not talking about out-of-body stuff. We're not talking about ecstatic experiences. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about that which gets us to Christ dwelling in us to the point where we have that sense of the fullness of God in this what Paul would call a normal, fully optimized Christian experience. This is that Acts 1:8, you shall be my disciples, meaning you shall be witnesses unto me. This is how others will perceive Christ in us. Otherwise, they just see me, or they just see, however I'm identified as myself. How will they see Christ? How will I be recognized? And if we don't live in an age now where how easy would it be for a Christian to be exposed? Now, wow, it should be like so easy in this cancel culture, right? It would be so easy to be canceled. Boom! This video probably won't even air now. How easy would it be just to be, whoosh, you're done, right? So just think about it. Were 3:19 to be suddenly the living reality in your life, how many? I'm not saying it would be a good thing for others to see this in you, but it would just be obvious that you've stepped into a different dimension. You've stepped into a sort of a different phase. And they're dealing with Christ now. They're dealing with it's just a different conversation now. A different dynamic is on the table, and it isn't just for others, but for you and for me, right? Because it's this idea that it sort of changes. It changes us within this that surpasses knowledge. And Paul was just trying to say this is just a whole different level in which God begins to enrich us, enrich our lives. And it is a different satisfaction of life, a different quality of life than one that just craves after stuff and the material things of this world, or one that just becomes anxious, about everything, every little thing, that's going on in the world. Lord, thank you for your opportunity to look into your words some more and make just a little bit of progress in this passage. So help us to understand it, help us to apply it, help us to live it, and help us to show it. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.